the Sony XB30 versus the Sony XB32. I want this video to basically be about the difference in sound modes between the two. So it's not just about, do the two speakers sound different? They actually have different sound modes. XB30, flat mode, extra bass mode. Extra bass button on the top turns extra bass on and off. So it alternates between extra bass and a flat mode. Flat's supposed to be more like its original tuning, whereas on the new Sony XB32, the button on the top is the live button, which seems a bit weird. It's clear to me the default setting is and should be extra bass. I know there's an argument below 50%, the XB30, you probably want to play it flat and put your bass up to +10 in the EQ app, which embeds the settings. But on the XB32, it will alternate between the live mode, but it actually says live rather than extra bass, which I find a bit weird because we're going to get to the sound clips. You'll see my thoughts on it and what you think should be the default mode. It's almost suggesting the default mode should be live. But anyway, if you hit the live mode button on the XB32, it will switch between extra bass and live. There is another setting which you can go into your app. It's the standard mode. The standard mode is not the flat mode on the XB30. It's actually a power saving mode. And the actual difference is it really what this video is all about. What is the difference between each sound mode, and also, of course, how do the two speakers compare to each other? Just before I get to the sound clips, I'm just going to go over the actual differences of the two speakers. The obvious difference is they are different form factors. You've got the slightly heavier XB30, it's 980 grams. You've got the XB32, it's 900 grams. It's actually slightly lighter, and it's more of like a triangular shape, whereas the Sony XB30 is more of a rectangular, linear kind of a shape. So it's got angles on, whereas that's more of a curved nature. Look, I have to say, it actually feels quite nice in the hand. Obviously, it fits your hand a little bit nicer, a little bit more easily than the XB32. Actual length-wise, the XB30 is slightly smaller than the XB32. People are talking about the new rubberized design. On the XB30, just got a mesh, and you can actually see the speakers through there. It's clear, whereas because they've now gone to an IP67 rating, which means XB32 can now be submerged in up to 1 meter of water for 30 minutes. IP5 on the XB30, which means it's only like water jet proof. You can't submerge it, and a heavy downpour may have terrible repercussions. However, I have to say, whereas with some of the JBL speakers, you can submerge them in 1 meter of water, but you put them in the water, it's face down. It's completely pointless. You can't just let it float in a swimming pool. Whereas this has actually been thought through, and it does actually play with the speakers floating upright if you place it in a swimming pool. So the sound modes are different. They sound different. They both have Bluetooth 4.2. They're both limited to about 30-foot Bluetooth line of sight range. Both have 48mm drivers. They both have stereo. And these days you've actually got to say, oh wow, it's got stereo, because we seem to be getting mono drivers now. So the likes of JBL going with a mono speaker, it's getting a bit crazy. Both got twin passive radiators, one firing forward, one firing back, and they both have grills on the rear. Battery life still about the same. However, it's an issue because if you run down to a battery level of 20%, it's going to cut the volume maximum to 20%. So it's pretty much unusable by the time you get to 20%. So if you talk about using it in extra bass mode, lighting on, obviously, the LEDs that you can play around with and change the settings in the app, you're probably looking at about 8 hours for both speakers in real world use using what are probably for most people the default settings. Obviously, that will change depending on the volume you play it on. But for mixed use, maybe around 70% use most of the time, about 8 hours. Though they advertise 24 hours. I have to say, they do advertise 24 hours, and they do have a disclaimer. It says, 24 hours, standard mode, lighting off. Well, standard mode is a power saving mode, and turning lighting off, well, that's obviously going to save you battery. So You know, a bit disingenuous to say 24 hours when clearly nobody is going to buy a speaker to use it in a standard mode, and the reasons for that will become clear in this video. The XB32, as with the XB31, has this game-changing party booster mode. If I bang my XB30, nothing happens. This is terrible. If I bang my XB32, well, it's a game changer. I mean, and actually, even if you enjoy doing that, it doesn't quite keep up. So it's not like, yeah, I mean, it's not terrible, but there is a lag. Even for intended use, yeah, it's a bit naff, to be quite honest with you. They're both rated 20 Hertz to 20 kilohertz, which is a bit ridiculous. It's not going to play down to 20 Hertz to anything that you're going to hear. I mean, if you're going to, like, I don't know, minus 100 decibels, yeah, okay, 20 Hertz. In the real world, and, you know, within what most people would consider the specs you should publish, plus or minus 3 decibels, you're talking around 55 to 60 Hertz at the bottom end of the bass. But yes, it does play up to 20 kilohertz. Some of these speakers will cut off around 17,000 kilohertz on the basis that not many people can hear sounds that high. Some of the buttons are now hidden behind a flap. So if I pull open the flap, and it is a little bit watery, I have to say, because I did test it in a bucket of water to see exactly what it would do, and it's still a little bit wet. And while I'm at it, also, people are talking about how easily this will mark up and get fingerprints. I have to say, the new design, you really do end up with it full of smudges and marks and finger marks. And worse than that, I have already, and I don't even know how, got a black mark I can't get out. So I've had it on a shelf or something. I don't know exactly what it was. It's got a black mark. I assumed I could just rub that off, and I can't actually get that black mark out. So yes, the comments about being a bit of a magnet for marking, absolutely correct, and it's worse than that. Some of these marks I cannot get rid of. So in terms of what's hidden now behind the flap, well, one of the buttons that was actually quite useful. Apart from the fact to add speakers, you've now got to open the flap. When I say add speakers, of course, the XB32 will of course support party chain up to 100 speakers, the XB30 party chain 10 speakers. But to add them, it's handy, you can use the buttons on the top of your XB30. You cannot do that. You've got to go to the buttons at the back there. Just quickly say the battery about 70%. 70%. I have to tell you, when I switched this on, and I haven't actually played any music through it, it said battery at 100%. But the point being, that's one of the buttons hidden behind. But you can now set it so that when it switches on, it will tell you the power level. But it's highly inaccurate. It's gone without any use from 100% to 70%. Whereas the battery indicator, I can just press the top of the XB30. It's not connected right now, so I'm not going to test it. It will tell you what the battery level is when you switch it on, but if you want to just quickly do that yourself, the button there is hidden behind the flap. You've also got, as I said, the buttons to party chain. You've got your charging port. It's now micro USB on the XB32. It was proprietary on the XB30, but you could still get a USB lead with a corresponding ending on the end of that USB lead, and so you could charge your XB30 straight from a USB hub. However, it would have to be that cable because the end is still a proprietary. A lot of people are complaining that the XB2 should now be USB-C. For me, it's not a huge issue. You know, charging by micro USB, most of my speakers are micro USB. It's not a huge issue for me. Some people it is. You can use both of them, by the way, as a power bank. You've got a USB out. And it's salt water proof now on the XB32, if that's a deal breaker to you. So those are the real differences between the two speakers. But for me, it's all about the sound. I'm not really worried about the rest of it. In terms of the sound and the different sound modes and comparing them both, these are my sound clips at 33%.
Down to the ground, you're dragging me. It's constantly. No, I won't make a sound. I love the pain. It sets me free. It's wrong, I can't make right. I love the bird below you, telling myself that this
somewhere inside haunting, like a drug I keep on wanting. There's a love that fits so perfect it's hard to believe. There's a reason I can feel my heart stop beating, and the air gets tough just breathing. I'm alone but I'm still feeling like someone's with me. It's strange, I know, but I feel like you're here with me, like chasing ghosts. I know you're out there.
Down to the ground, you're dragging me. It's constantly. No, I won't make a sound. I love the pain. It sets me free.
It's wrong, I can't make right. I love the bird below you, telling myself that this is the last. It's wrong, I can't make right. Slipping off in the moonlight when I knew the truth. I hurt myself for you. On the ground, I know the truth. I know the truth. Oh, now I'm on the ground. I know the truth. I'm shaking now, 'cause you say those things.
33% XB32 extra bass mode versus live mode. Live mode actually has 0.2 decibels more in the bass. Bass goes as deep on both, 57 Hertz. And then the real difference is live mode reduces a little bit between about 400 Hertz and 3,500 Hertz. And then even more as you go towards the high end, until right at the very high end, it's basically cut from about 18,000 Hertz drastically if you compare to XB32, if you compare to extra bass mode. Extra bass mode versus standard mode, 33%. Basically when you go to standard mode, which is what Sony call their power saving mode, you're losing a huge amount of bass. So in this case, 9.6 decibels quieter in the bass at 33% than if you was in extra bass mode, but also it's cutting the highs. The XB30 plays louder at 33% than when you're playing on the XB32. So XB32, 15.2, minus 15.2 in the bass, extra bass mode on the XB30, 1.8 decibels higher in the bass, but it's stronger everywhere, and you get this constant dip around 100 to about 700 Hertz on all modes with the XB32, which isn't there on the XB30, or indeed on the original in the middle, XB30 to the right, XB32 to the left. You can see this dip, which is consistent. It's 100 to 700 Hertz. Isn't there on the original, and it isn't there on the XB30. So the XB30, although it's extra bass mode, and most people will play in flat mode below 50% and stick the extra bass up to get it a little bit more balanced. Comparing like for like, extra bass mode, XB30 is more accurate, and it doesn't have the dip. There's also a dip between about 7,000 Hertz and 9,000 Hertz on all modes that isn't there on the original or the XB30. So even if you say a lot of the difference may be down to the tuning, even if you use the app to stick the bass to its maximum plus 10, the differences are still exactly the same. So XB32, XB30, both with plus 10, so to the maximum bass you're going to get out of it, you're still a decibel louder in the bass with the XB30. So slightly less difference, but you always get this missing section between 100 and 700 Hertz on the XB32, which isn't a pleasant listen. It takes away some of the warmth. It includes the upper bass, and again around 7,000 to 9,000 Hertz, which you're not getting on the XB30, or indeed the original XB30 to the right, XB32 to the left. That dip is always there, around 100 to 700, and 7,000 to 9,000 Hertz, not on the original, and not on XB30. XB30 clearly, no matter what you do with the EQ, is more accurate. So the takeaway is, at 33%, if you're using the same volume level, the XB30 will sound louder. It is louder at 33%. Sounds fuller. You're not getting the dips that you're getting on the XB32. Obviously, the drivers are not so obscured, giving you a bit of a clearer sound, whereas pretty much obscured on the XB32 because of the grille for your waterproofing. So you're going to go louder. You're going to play it 66%.
I'm walking alone, the streets are empty. The only thing I can see is my own silhouette. I'm getting stronger, step by step. The clock is ticking, but there's no time for regrets. I've been flying from town to town, from London to Taiwan. I've been all around the globe, trying to protect your soul. We are heroes tonight. We will fly above the sky. We are heroes tonight. Yeah. We are heroes tonight. We will fly above the sky. We are heroes tonight. Feel like a dynamite, ready to explode right up in the sky. I need you to listen, I need you to hear, and don't show. silhouette. I'm getting stronger, step by step. The clock is ticking, but there's no time for regrets. I've been flying from town to town, from London to Taiwan. I've been all around the globe, trying to protect your soul. We are heroes tonight. We will fly above the sky. We are heroes tonight. I need you to hear and don't show.
66% volume is basically the same story. XB32 extra bass mode, live mode, bass almost the same, again about 0.2 decibels in it, but live mode reducing the mids and the highs even more than it reduces the mids. Extra bass mode versus standard mode, actually again huge dollop off the bass, not as much as at 33%, so now the difference is only 5.2 decibels, and that's really the big difference. You just get less bass in standard mode. XB32 extra bass mode versus XB30 extra bass mode. Now a bit different. So now there's slightly more bass in the XB32, but so much more going on in the rest of the sound with the XB30. First of all, you don't get this huge dip, 100 to 700 hertz, which does give a hollow nature to the sound. You don't get this 7,000 to 9,000 dip. So overall, it plays louder, although the bass is slightly louder on the XB32. In terms of accuracy, XB30 on the right, XB32 to the left. Always this dip, 100 to 700 hertz, is affecting any accuracy you're hoping for. It's affecting the warmth because it includes the upper bass, lower mids. So again, XB30, more accurate. Use the EQ to stick the bass to +10. So the maximum of what each mode can do. Extra bass mode, live mode, more bass on the extra bass mode, and live mode cutting mids and highs. Standard mode, now only 3.7 decibels quieter in the bass. So the difference is much smaller. If you put bass to maximum and still use standard mode, although I guess you wouldn't because standard mode is supposed to be a power saving mode, and of course most power is in the bass, so it's cutting the bass. 66% XB30, XB32. If you use bass to maximum via the EQ, bass is about the same now. 65 hertz, about minus 18 decibels. But you get much more upper bass, lower mids with the XB30. It's some fuller sound. The highs, look at the very high end to the minus 48 decibel line on the XB30, but you're below minus 54 decibels on the XB32. So all across the frequency range, it's a much stronger, fuller sound on the XB30. At +10 on the bass, original in the middle, XB32 on the right, XB30 on the left. Again, because of the dip, 100 to 700 hertz on the XB32, the XB30, more accurate. So less in it at 66%. Obviously, the volume scales on the two speakers are a little bit different. XB30 favours low-level listening. XB32 tuned more for the high levels. When I say tuned, I mean, you know, the way the volume scale is a little bit different. They're not they're not linear in the way they adjust for the volume. So the limits of what they can and can't do. Full out. I'm now going to use not just bass at +10, I'm putting the mids and the highs to +10. So I'm getting rid of all the differences that may still be there simply because the bass tuning. Pushing everything as far as you can just to see how much headroom you get on either speaker. This is the result. So in terms of sheer, how loud can it get? When you push everything at the maximum, the bass, the mids, the highs to absolute maximum, extra bass mode on both the XB30, XB32. So it's like for like, you're taking out what may be a difference in bass tuning. So you're pushing everything to the absolute limit that you could do using the app. What is the difference? So at maximum volume, the XB32 extra bass mode, XB30 extra bass mode, pushing everything as high as it would go, the bass and mids, the highs to +10, to get rid of any differences in bass tuning. So the absolute maximum, how loud will they go? What is the real difference between the two when they're both pushed to the limit? The XB32, bass -27 decibels, the XB30 -21.5 decibels. So in terms of absolute bass peak, around the 70 Hertz mark on both, the XB32 is actually slightly louder by 0.8 decibels. But in terms of the overall sound, there's a huge difference. So in terms of the average sound, so if you add up all the frequency range, the power at each part of the frequency range, on average, the XB32 is 1.8 decibels quieter than the XB30. And if I use a sound pressure level meter at 1 meter, the difference is even bigger. It's 3.4 decibels, which is like doubling the power. So the difference is huge. When they are both pushed, the XB30 will go much louder, mostly because it has a fuller sound. So although the XB32 can match the bass peak and go as low as the XB30 does, because it has this drop in upper bass and lower mids, as you can see compared to the XB30, the upper mids, when you push it to absolute maximum, -21, you're down at -27 on the XB32. 6 decibels difference in that upper bass and around the lower mids. And the XB32 stronger all the way along. So it just plays louder because it's stronger across the whole frequency range. You have a dip on the XB32 in every mode that you try, around 100 to 700 Hertz and around 7,000 to 9,000 Hertz. There's another dip. It affects the sound. So I have to say, when I first got the XB32 and I played it in live mode, I thought, actually, that's quite pleasant. It's a little bit laid back. You get a little bit of a shimmer. It is more airy. It's, you know, the idea is it's more of a surround sound type tuning, and it's pleasant at first. But the more I listen and the more I push it, it starts to sound weird. Obviously, heavy processing going on, and I have to say, after an initial, you know, oh, that's quite nice for a few minutes, it kind of got a bit silly. It didn't sound good at all. Once my ears start listening for certain things that I'm used to hearing. Someone did mention it sounds great actually live mode when you play a pair of XB32s in a full-on stereo mode, you know, nicely separated, and that airiness really transfers into a nice surround sound. Well, okay, I don't know. I've only got a single Sony XB32, so I can only give my opinion on the single speaker. And in that case, for me, that makes the extra bass mode really the only mode that I will now use on the Sony XB32. I have to say also, I keep mentioning the dips that are there and you can't get rid of. You know, 100 to 700 Hertz, 7,000 to 9,000 Hertz. That part of the spectrum's gone. However, it does lend itself a little bit to vocals. The vocals kind of stand out because there's not so much going on around it. Whereas with the XB30, much fuller sound right all the way through the frequency range, does sound a bit congested in some ways. However, side by side, the difference in body is quite stark. So overall, you know, I'm going for the XB30 because there's more headroom. If you're going to use your own EQ settings, if you're going to use, you know, not just Sony's app, but another app, you know, with more bands that you can really tailor it, the headroom's there to really tailor your sound on the XB30. You haven't got that headroom on the XB32 because it doesn't actually go as loud anyway, and there's parts of that spectrum are gone. Nothing you can do about it. You've got to wave goodbye. So yeah, I still think if you're not going to submerge it, if you're going to play it in a swimming pool, you know, and you want it to float, it's a no-brainer. It's an XB32, isn't it? If you're comparing these two particular speakers. If you like a full-bodied, full-on sound, you're still going to prefer the Sony XB30. If you don't need to play it in a swimming pool, you'll probably prefer the XB30. The value's there because you're going to get some decent prices second-hand on the XB30. So I prefer the XB30 in extra bass mode, just to say most people play +10 on the bass, +10 on the highs, flat below 50%. extra bass above that. I don't. I personally use it all the time in extra bass, and I have a trade-off in those settings, like about +5-ish and a +5 on the treble and the highs, so it's a bit more of an all-round sound. So you don't have to keep switching settings that you want. I do like the XB30. I've loved my JBL Charge 3s for a long time. I kind of play this more. Although I have to say my go-to speaker has become the Sony XB40, which, it's just a bigger sound, it's got bigger drivers. It's actually my favourite speaker at the moment. I do, of course, love my mini rigs. I've got the full 2.2 system, not just the Mark III, but the Mark II as well. And for a high-end listen, yeah, that's still my favourite, but it's a bit messy to start, getting everything together and getting it set up. So my go-to speaker has become, not a JBL speaker after all these years, a Sony, the Sony XB40. So I hope my video answers some of the questions you may have had. It answered my own personal questions and the difference between them, not just the speakers, but the sound modes. So I hope you found it helpful. Thank you for watching.
UK